Welcome everyone. This is Libby Mucciaroni, Associate Director of Education, Technology, and Member Engagement at the Organic Trade Association. I'm pleased to welcome you all to part 2 of our series on soil amendments with the Produce Safety Alliance on science-based composting practices. A couple of housekeeping items before we start the presentation today. This webinar is being recorded. Our panelists have provided a number of helpful links as companions during the presentation, as well as some handouts. We will share all of those links through the chat box throughout today's presentation, and then also in a follow-up email for you. In the next 2 business days, all registrants will receive a follow-up email that will include PDF slides from today's presentation, helpful links, as I mentioned, and a registration link to view today's recording as well. During registration, we ask that you let our presenters know if you had any questions on today's topic. With over 250 registrants, we're so thankful to yet again have a diverse and engaged audience. Your questions have been taken into account in the panelists' presentations and in preparation for our Q&A panel. For any questions or comments that you may have during our discussion today, please share them with us in the questions pane on the platform. Our presenters will respond to your questions as time permits during our Q&A panel, and for any questions that we are unable to answer today, we'll follow up with you within the next week. And finally, if you happen to have any technical issues during the presentation today, you can notify us either in the questions pane or you can email me directly for assistance. Today's webinar is, as I said earlier, the second of a 2-part series on soil amendments. If you haven't seen the first session, we do encourage you to register by watching it on demand for managing soil amendments for food safety and soil health. That link was sent when you first joined the meeting today, and I will send it through the chat in just a moment as well. The Organic Center is a nonprofit research and education organization based out of Washington, D.C. They work to conduct and convene credible, evidence-based science on the environmental and health effects of organic food and farming, and to communicate the findings to the public. The Organic Center's work is supported by companies and individuals who desire a sustainable and secure food system that promotes the health of humans and the environment. The Organic Trade Association is a membership-based organization for the organic industry. We ensure that all parts of the organic value chain have a strong voice in government and in our communities. We bring farmers, processors, distributors, retailers, and others together to promote and protect the growing organic sector. OTA represents its members to government on sector needs, market development and promotion, and strong organic standards and regulations. Members also receive the latest information and quick answers on organic regulations and standards in the United States and around the world. Today's webinar, we are so excited and pleased to have such a wonderful panel. And first, I will be welcoming on our moderator for today's webinar. Today's webinar is hosted and moderated by Dr. Amber Saligo, Associate Director of Science Programs at the Organic Center. You can learn more about Amber and the Organic Center on our website at organic-center.org. And you can find more about us on social media, and I'll send some links through the chat in just a moment. But with that, I will hand things over to my colleague, Amber.
Thanks, Libby. Can you hear me okay? Perfect.
I can hear you, yep.
Great. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second webinar in our 2-part webinar series about managing soil amendments for both food safety and soil health. We are always happy to have you joining us. And if you missed last week's webinar, don't worry, today's will still make sense. They're more complementary, but also Libby has posted the link to the recording in the chat if you want to watch last week's webinar later. So I'm going to start today with a little bit of background and some recap from last week, and then I'll hand it over to Donna Clements, who will be our main presenter. And we're hoping that today we're going to have plenty of time to get to questions, as last week we had a lot of engagement and we had some lingering questions that we didn't get to, and we'd like to answer them today if we can. So after Donna presents, Dr. Alda Pierce and Betsy Bin will join in to help answer some of those questions. Okay, so last week's webinar focused on how to use animal-based soil amendments to improve soil health, while also allowing us to consider food safety risks and minimize those risks as much as possible. And today's webinar will focus on science-based composting practices that growers can use to help minimize food safety risks. And my understanding is that we are going to learn a lot about what counts as treated manure, as well as methods for composting. As we mentioned last week, the Organic Center has been working with today's presenters for over 5 years. Our collaboration started with a USDA OREI funded planning grant. OREI stands for Organic Agriculture Research and Extension Initiative, and that's a NIFA program in the USDA. And this grant allowed us to assess how and why organic farmers across the United States were using manure as well as other animal-based soil amendments. And we also asked them what their research needs were. And from that assessment, we were able to then develop a multi-regional field project, which was also funded by the OREI program, that then allowed us to directly analyze in the field food safety in the context of raw manure use. In the previous webinar, Dr. Pires gave a detailed description of what that multi-regional research project looked like. And I'm just going to sum it up very briefly, by saying that the project entailed 3 different field research teams across the US, one in California, Minnesota, and Maine. And those teams then analyzed foodborne pathogen presence as well as persistence over time from different animal sources of manure that were applied to different crops. The teams also explored which factors influenced that prevalence and persistence of different pathogens, and some of these results were presented last week and also helped inform the food safety modules that Donna is presenting across this webinar series. Finally, I also wanted to reiterate some background to this work that Dr. Shade shared last week because it gives some good context for this entire webinar series. A lot of this work began about 8 years ago when the FDA proposed revisions to the Food Safety Modernization Act, which we just usually say FSMA. And those revisions included changes to the required wait period between the application of untreated manure and the harvest of the treated crop. The FDA had proposed a 9-month minimum interval requirement, which could be complicated for some fast-growing crops like lettuce, if you can imagine. And this recommendation directly contradicted the National Organic Program regulations for the application of raw manure. That ruling was not adopted because the FDA decided that further research was needed. This was largely in thanks to comments from OTA and also people on this webinar. And so we reached out to Alda and the rest of the team to try to develop research that would make sure that organic systems were included in the collection of that additional data that the FDA would then consider for future rulemaking. And some of that research is what we're presenting in this series. And because the research is ongoing, we will continue to roll out those results as they come. So one more thing before I hand over the mic, I just want to very briefly introduce our speakers for today. Our main presenter will be Donna Clements, who has served as the Produce Safety Alliance Southwest Regional Extension Associate since 2015. She is currently based in Riverside, California, and she leads training courses on the FSMA Produce Safety Rule. Donna also provides technical assistance to growers and produce safety educators, and she develops educational food safety resources like the ones that we are seeing in this webinar series. Donna will later be joined by Betsy Bin in the Q&A session. And Betsy is a senior extension associate in the Department of Food Science at Cornell University. She is currently the director of the Produce Safety Alliance and the National Good Agricultural Practices Program, which it's easier to say GAP for. She has over 22 years in extension, and her program aims to reduce microbial risks to fresh fruits and vegetables. And she accomplishes this by developing educational materials through very interdisciplinary collaborations with stakeholders like growers, farm workers, produce industry personnel, students, teachers, and consumers. And last but not least, we have Dr. Alda Pires, who will also join in the Q&A. And Alda is an associate extension specialist in the urban agriculture and food safety in the School of Veterinary Medicine at the University of California, Davis. And her research focuses on pre-harvest food safety and mitigation strategies to help reduce food safety risks in the farm environment with a specialization in small-scale, organic, and diversified production systems. So we thank all of our panelists in advance. We're so excited to have them here today. And with all of that, I will now hand it over to Donna.
Thank you, Amber, and thank you for that introduction. So as Amber mentioned, this week in this module, we're really going to focus in on treatment strategies, particularly science-based composting practices. Next. And in the next 30 minutes or so, we have a couple of objectives that we want to address. The first one is going to be more of an overview. Very similar to last week, we are going to discuss the differences between untreated and treated biological soil amendments of animal origin, also known with the acronym BSAAO or BSAAO. We are going to talk a little bit about the value of compost, including how it reduces risks from using biological soil amendments of animal origin and improving soil health, discuss the science behind these key treatment strategies and how they reduce risks, and then additionally discuss considerations for successful treatment. And as Amber mentioned, we are going to have some time for Q&A at the end. Next. So this slide is really intended to be an overview of some of the key concepts that we discussed last week in the introduction. And the first thing that I wanted to do here is define the word soil amendment. So in the FSMA Produce Safety Rule, as Amber mentioned, that is a federal regulation that requires covered farms to implement certain food safety practices. So in that federal regulation, the definition of a soil amendment is any chemical, biological, or physical material that is intentionally added to the soil to improve the chemical or physical condition of the soil in relation to plant growth or to improve soil health, specifically the capacity of soil to hold water. So I think it's important to kind of get that basic category of soil amendment out of the way. And I did really want to highlight that when we discuss soil amendments throughout this module, we're really talking about those that are intentionally added to the soil. And I'll go back to that point in a couple of slides. Now, the Produce Safety Rule categorizes soil amendments kind of into a couple of categories, but for our purposes, we are going to be looking at biological soil amendments of animal origin. So specifically, there are some examples of those that are manure, post-consumer vegetative waste, also known as table waste. And then there's also this other category. And I'm mentioning this because I saw that there were a couple of pre-submitted questions that asked about mineral-based soil amendments such as lime that's added to increase the pH of the soil, chemical soil amendments, and things like that. But in the Produce Safety Rule, only biological soil amendments of animal origin are those that are going to be regulated. And then the last category of biological soil amendments of animal origin that I wanted to talk about are treated versus untreated. For those of you who caught the webinar last week, we spent a lot of time talking about untreated soil amendments, specifically biological soil amendments of animal origin and how they could be used. This week, we're really focusing on treated soil amendments and why those are important. The key here is that treated biological soil amendments of animal origin can reduce microbial risks. And that's really, for food safety purposes, one of the big reasons that we're discussing them. But in terms of growers, we are really focusing on these biological soil amendments next. We're really focusing on these biological soil amendments of animal origin, the treated ones, because the way that they are applied, stored, handled are going to be different than the ones that are not treated. So we're going to focus throughout this module on how the treatment status, whether a soil amendment is treated or untreated, how it impacts handling practices, whether it's allowed to be come in contact or even touch the harvestable portion of the crop, and then also record keeping. Next. So in the introduction, Amber did a great job of mentioning this OREI project. And one of the deliverables of that project was a survey or a needs assessment of organic growers. And I included some of the survey results here because I think it gives a very interesting view of how biological soil amendments of animal origin are being used by organic growers. The first thing I wanted to highlight was that 48% of organic growers surveyed used compost. And I do want to note, because this survey was only among organic growers, this information is probably skewed a little bit towards showing a lot of use of compost, untreated manure, because organic growers are somewhat limited in the types of soil amendments that they can use, right? They have to really stick with non-synthetic soil amendments. So I did want to make that point. But it looks like compost was the major soil amendment used specifically in growing fresh produce, where over half of the growers surveyed, organic growers surveyed, used compost. So for that reason, we are going to spend a lot of time talking about treatment strategies, specifically composting strategies in this module. The other thing I found really interesting was that the majority of compost was purchased commercially, about 75%, followed by on-site production. Usually this is going to be produced on the farm, and local non-commercial. And I like this local non-commercial strategy or category because when I hear from growers, I often hear growers say, you know what, I buy compost or I pick up compost from the guy down the street. It's not really commercial. It's not a composting business, and how does that category fall? And I thought it was interesting that 24% of those people surveyed use compost from these sort of non-commercial composting locations. And then the last thing that I wanted to show was the main treatments that growers are using to make compost. And of note, the two largest categories were windrow composting at 65%, and aerated static pile composting at 22%, with a couple of other categories that are sort of much lower percentages. And these two treatments are the ones that are currently validated in the produce safety rules. So we are going to go into windrow composting and aerated static pile composting in a little bit more detail. Next. So before we jump into the actual composting treatments, I wanted to highlight some of the reasons that a grower might decide to use compost or purchase compost on their farm. And not sure if we're on the right side, but one of the big reasons in food safety that we talk about using composted biological soil amendments of animal origin is because the composting process is known to kill off human pathogens. So we talk a lot about the destruction of human pathogens. And the reason here is that those thermophilic temperatures, usually once we see 131 degrees Fahrenheit and over, they are very good at killing off pathogens because human pathogens, plant pathogens, a number of those are not great at surviving at those really high temperatures. Some of the other reasons that we use composted biological soil amendments of animal origin are to kill off plant pathogens, insect larvae, and weed seeds. And the same concept occurs here, where a lot of these plant pathogens, insect larvae, and weed seeds do not survive very well in these thermophilic temperatures. I also want to mention this concept of competitive exclusion, and we touched on this a little bit last week, where in addition to high temperatures killing off pathogens, we also see from research that environmental pathogens are much better, and they're much better adapted at surviving in the environment than human pathogens. And I should say environmental organisms are better at surviving in the environment than human pathogens. And for that reason, we see that these environmental organisms have a competitive exclusion. so that we see a diverse array of environmental organisms in these compost piles, and they just simply outcompete pathogens. And that's another reason that they hypothesize that these pathogens are killed off. So some of the other reasons that growers may opt to use a compost or a treated biological soil amendment of animal origin is this composting process has improved handling and storage. And we know that through the composting process, treated soil amendments often have a reduced volume and weight. So often we'll see a reduced weight of about 40 to 80%. And so they're just a lot easier to handle than like a sludgy manure might be. They also have reduced odors. I'm sure if many of us have stuck our noses in our hands in manure piles versus a compost pile, I can tell you which one I would probably rather handle barehanded. And then also compost is known for its uniform fine textured soil amendment, as a uniform fine textured soil amendment. And you can see this in the images to the right. The top image, we have a very slightly composted pile, it's still early in its stages of treatment. And you can pick out, if you were to look closely, you can pick out some of the parent material. We have raw potatoes, we have some other table scraps, whereas the image on the bottom looks more like a finely textured, almost like a mulch. And this is still in its treatment stages. It's not complete, but it looks like it's much easier to handle. It's a little bit lighter in color as well. And then the last reason is nutrient stabilization. And this is one of the primary reasons in production that growers like to use compost. And compost is known to stabilize, so it's less susceptible to leaching if you have heavy rainfall. You're not going to get as much nutrients leaching potentially into the groundwater or leaching out of the compost, and it's going to be less susceptible to nitrogen loss. Next. Okay, so I wanted to give a quick overview about some of the biological activities that are happening during the compost treatment process. And the first thing that I want to highlight is when we talk about composting, it's all about managing beneficial microorganisms. So we see a succession of aerobic microorganisms throughout this composting process. So normally, the first organisms that move in are going to be aerobic bacteria. And these aerobic bacteria decompose very, very quickly. So they move in, they start decomposing immediately, and then later, toward the end of the process, we see fungi and actinomycetes. Actinomycetes are a filamentous bacteria. And the key here is that these fungi and actinomycetes move in and they break down resistant materials. So like those heavy, woody, ligninous materials, they're very good at breaking those down, but it takes a little bit longer in that stage. But the take-home message is that those thermophilic temperatures are a sign of healthy composting because the above microorganisms thrive in those high temperatures, unlike human pathogens. So that's why when we talk about managing compost and monitoring compost, one of the big requirements is to take the temperature and make sure that temperature stays up high. Next. Okay, so now that we talked a little bit about the background of composting, why people may opt to either compost on the farm or use a treated compost, I want to talk a little bit about using treated biological soil amendments of animal origin as a way to reduce risk. And this is really to help mitigate any potential food safety issues. And I want to mention that the federal regulation, the Food Safety Modernization Act Produce Safety Rule, outlines 2 different composting methods. However, it does allow for other validated risk-reducing processes to be used. And just like I mentioned, the 2 validated methods that are written in the Produce Safety Rule, we're going to go into those in a few slides, but they are both an aerobic thermophilic process. So they're both 2 different types of composting processes. And the other nice thing is that these two processes are based on EPA regulations, and they align with the acceptable methods in the USDA National Organic Program. Next. Okay, so I wanted to take a moment here and walk through what the two composting options are that are listed in the produce safety rule as validated processes. The first one is a turned or windrow composting. And the key here is, so any of you who are organic growers or composters and are familiar with the NOP, these two processes should look very, very familiar. So windrow composting relies on a certain time, temperature, and turning. So the idea here is that turning method will really help to aerate the pile, and it will help disperse temperatures throughout the pile evenly. And then the second method is aerated static composting. And in a few slides, I have some photos of what these two methods look like. So next. Okay, so before we dig into those two composting methods, I wanted to highlight the variables that I just talked about: time, temperature, turnings, especially. And the three variables listed on the left column here, these, you notice from the previous slide, are the process monitoring requirements for those two different composting standards, for windrow composting and for aerated static composting. The temperature, as I mentioned, the key here is to maintain those thermophilic temperatures because A, they help with pathogen reduction, and they also are a sign that the composting process is healthy and it's chugging along, really well. Turning, as I mentioned, the importance of turning, particularly for windrow composting, which is where a grower would set up piles or windrows of compost being treated, that turning process does a couple of things. The first thing is it facilitates aeration. So it facilitates the oxygen getting out through the pile because I mentioned that we're really trying to build up the aerobic microorganisms. The second thing it does is it helps distribute the temperature. For those of you who tuned in last week, I showed a photo of an aged manure pile, and one of the issues with aged manure, as opposed to compost, is that because it's not turned, it builds up really hot zones. So at the top, in the middle, you get these really hot zones, whereas toward the edges of the pile, it's a little bit cooler. By turning windrows through that composting step, it helps in distributing that temperature out so we can try to get thermophilic temperatures throughout that whole pile. And then lastly, the time, it depends on a number of different factors, temperature, some of the variables on the right, but the time, it's going to depend on the health of the composting process. But we do have some approximations that we can expect how long that composting process is going to take. I do want to quickly highlight the variables on the right here, namely the compost feedstock. What are you putting into your compost? Are you using a poultry litter or poultry waste? Are you using horse bedding? Horse bedding is known to have a pretty balanced carbon to nitrogen ratio, but that compost feedstock is going to help influence how long it takes because, as many of you know, we're really trying to get to that healthy carbon to nitrogen ratio balance to make sure that there's enough nutrition to fuel the process, but not too much so that it prolongs a really long time. Okay, oxygen availability and then moisture are also additional treatment variables. And I want to highlight here that even though the composting processes I showed in the previous slide really only focus on those three process variables, there are these additional variables to consider if you were looking for a healthy composting treatment process. Next. So this next slide, planning for success, really is going to highlight the layout of the next few slides in this presentation. It's going to wrap up the presentation, actually. So we talked a little bit about those 2 validated treatment processes. We will revisit those. But for any of you attending this webinar who are growers who are trying to plan ahead, either with compliance in the FSMA produce safety rule, or you're just trying to think about implementing a treatment process or implementing purchasing soil amendments for your farm, there are a number of factors to consider. So the first one is, are you going to compost on the farm, and deciding on the treatment system that might work best for you? Or if you decide to purchase from a commercial source, what type of soil amendment are you going to purchase? What documentation do you need? We're going to talk a little bit about the application intervals and how soil amendments should be applied, as well as handling and storage, tools, and record keeping. Next. So I mentioned one of the validated composting treatments is an aerated static pile composting. And you can see here is a diagram of this process. And this is actually a diagram, but there are 2 different systems here. The first one you can see on the left is a negative system. So you can see this aerated pile. So, and you can see the arrows are coming in toward the pile. This is a negative system in that it is trying to suck air through the pile. So the blower is going to be coming out to the right, and then it's going through a small pile of screened compost that kind of serves as an odor filter. So this is a negative air pressure system, whereas the system in the back is a positive, and that just means that the blower is blowing air through the system. The key here is the word aerated. So even though this is a static pile system and there's no turning involved, the key is that it is aerated because we have this plastic pipe system that's running underneath the pile, and it's sucking or pushing air out. And the idea here is that there's still going to be an adequate amount of aeration for those aerobic microorganisms to work. Next. Okay, so there are a couple of factors to consider when building an aerated static pile system. The first thing is ensuring that the pile is homogeneous. So you want to make sure that it's not too heavy, it has a good structure, good porosity, because what you do not want to happen are for air channels to form. So this system, if it has an adequate structure, it should allow a slow, even airflow through the pile. And again, what you're trying to do is flush oxygen through the system. We also suggest covering the pile with a layer of finished compost, again for odor control, because in the early stages, depending on what raw feedstock you're putting into the compost, it can get a little bit smelly. So we do recommend covering it with a layer of finished compost. And also there is some training involved for the personnel who are going to be monitoring and maintaining the system. And it could include things like making sure that the actual piping does not clog, making sure that the aeration is happening properly, as well as handling and storage. And I just want to point out that the images on the right, these are both 2 different aerated static pile systems, and we see oxygen going through, aeration going through, and it's being pushed out by these black pipes. Next. Okay, so the second system that I wanted to hit on, and I think this one is, as the data showed, that I showed from the survey this morning, this system is much more common, especially for on-farm, because I think it's Windrow turned composting. I know I have a backyard system. It's much easier to do on a small scale, and you can also scale up. So this just tends to be the system that I see more frequently. And the idea here is that feedstock is placed into piles or windrows, and then it's turned regularly to help regulate the temperature, improve that aeration, and ensure efficient composting. And I do really want to highlight here that this system is very scalable. I show a couple of different types of equipment that's commonly used. Up in the right-hand corner, you can see a compost turner. Sometimes you'll see these attached to tractors and it's being pulled through, or you'll see a standalone compost turner. And then the image on the bottom right is much more of a hands-on, a smaller scale system where you have a three bay system, and you're using that to turn the compost into subsequent bays. Next. Okay, so we spent quite a bit of time talking through some of the treatment strategies and some of the variables that impact those strategies. The next topic that I want to address is something that I get a lot of questions on, especially when doing PSA grower training courses. And that is the topic of curing, which is usually considered to be the last stage in the composting treatment. So there is a definition of curing in the FSMA Produce Safety Rule, and this is the final stage of decomposition, which is conducted after much of the readily metabolized biological material is decomposed at cooler temperatures, et cetera, et cetera. But the key here is that definition of curing, it always struck me as a little bit flexible. So there's very limited processes listed on how to do a curing process. So I wanted to give you guys a little bit more information on what curing means and why it is important. So you can see here that this is the last step considered in sort of this compost process. And this happens after active treatment. Usually what it does is it allows smaller piles to facilitate air exchange. So we're usually putting the compost because it's decreased in temperature, active composting has slowed down. It's really used in smaller piles, and that allows aeration naturally to happen much more passively. It is very important to ensuring that compost is stable. So because there is still usually some metabolizing happening in the compost, but it's going to be much more slow, it's going to be at lower temperatures like I mentioned. So it just allows for a buffer to minimize potential issues from incomplete composting. And one of the issues, in addition to not having stabilized nutrients, which can lead to off-gassing or nutrient leaching and water runoff, is if incomplete compost is used or immature compost is used, certain plant roots are very sensitive and it can actually burn off the roots and the roots hairs. And that's usually due to too high of a nitrogen level or ammonium in the compost. But the reason I'm mentioning it is that the FSMA Produce Safety Rule requires curing to follow treatment. Next. Now, a couple of additional things to note when we talk about an effective curing step. The first one is, when do you know to transition into curing? And one of the keys here is following the temperature or monitoring the temperature. So for Windrow compost, if you notice that you've reached those process limits that I talked about before, X number of days at X temperature, that can be a good initial kind of thing to notice. However, once you start turning Windrow composting and the temperatures are no longer bumping up after turning, that is also a good sign that you might be ready to transition into that curing stage. In terms of the forced aeration strategy, temperatures will show a steady decrease and start to approach mesophilic levels. And there are a couple of other things here that I wanted to mention. Consider, because curing is usually going to take a little bit longer, they often say 1 to 4 months, depending on how mature your compost is when you put it into that curing stage. But it's a really good idea to think about where you're storing it so you don't potentially contaminate fields, food contact surfaces, and you don't have a lot of runoff. Next. And the last thing I wanted to note about compost maturity is that there are a couple of ways to help test the maturity. And in my experience, a lot of growers, I think, kind of play it by ear. They just set it aside for X number of months and then they'll decide to use it. So I think these compost maturity tests are often done more on the commercial scale, but there are a couple of different tests that people use. One of the traditional tests is a germination test. So they will germinate sensitive seeds in the compost mixture, and a low germination rate would indicate that potentially there's a problem, maybe that compost is not quite cured, and it might still have high levels of ammonia, which can burn off plant roots. The other test that I'm familiar with is the Solvita maturity test. And this, you can see on the right, there's a couple of images of paddles. These tests measure CO2 and ammonia off-gassing, and both of these are measures that the compost might not be mature yet. So because it's aerobic, an increase of CO2 would show that it's still metabolizing. Next. Okay, so to kind of wrap up this discussion, I wanted to highlight a couple of the produce safety rule microbial standards. So throughout this presentation so far, I've talked about the two validated methods that are listed in the produce safety rule: windrow composting and aerated static composting. It's very important to highlight that the produce safety rule does allow for other treatment methods, as long as those treatment methods conform to one of the two microbial standards listed here. So the first one is going to be more of a pathogen test. This is the first standard, and that is that the treatment process is validated to treat the compost to, or the soil amendment, to a level of no detectable Listeria monocytogenes, Salmonella species, and E. coli 0157H7. And any soil amendment that is validated to this standard, and when I say validated, I mean research has been done, and they show that this treatment will treat the soil amendment to this microbial standard, so it should not have these pathogens present. So any soil amendment validated to this level can be applied in any manner with no restrictions. And then the second standard is no detectable Salmonella species and fecal coliforms less than 1,000 colony-forming units in a gram or in a milliliter. And compost or soil amendments that are treated to this standard must be applied in a way to minimize potential contact during and after application. And that is important to mention because these two standards must be applied in two different ways. So they have a little bit of restrictions there in how they can be used. But I wanted to highlight that compost treated via windrow or aerated static system is expected to meet the standard according to the produce safety rule. So we've talked about those two validated treatments, windrow composting and aerated static composting. Those are both validated to the second standard. The take-home message here is that growers who are using this type of soil amendment do not have to batch test. So there's no microbial sampling required because those methods are already tested and validated against that standard. Next. Okay, so a couple of take-home messages, because I just spent a lot of time talking about the FSMA produce safety rule regulation, and I realize that a lot of you attending may not be covered or subject to this federal regulation. So again, I already mentioned that product testing is not a requirement in the produce safety rule. However, for any growers that are using compost, they just have to keep records of that treatment. But I really want to highlight here that we often consider the produce safety rule to be baseline requirements. So some of you in the room might be thinking, oh, you know, I live in a state that requires testing, or my state requires X, Y, and Z over what you just talked about. I highly recognize that the produce safety rule is considered to be baseline, and that there are industry standards that are more stringent, more strict, and additionally, that National Organic Program could have additional requirements here as well. Next. Okay, so to wrap up this discussion, I very briefly want to address a couple of additional common soil amendments that I hear about. And the first one is Vermicompost. So anybody not familiar with Vermicompost, it is worm compost or worm castings There are a number of benefits of using vermicompost in production. I list a couple of them here. But the question I often get is vermicompost considered a treatment like windrow composting is? And there is science available to demonstrate that the process does kill pathogens. However, it is not a thermophilic, it's not a high heat process like the other treatment strategies are. And they think that pathogen reduction is due to grinding, enzymatic digestion, competitive exclusion, like I talked about before. Next, so there is still some research being conducted on vermicompost, but the take home is that currently under the FSMA produce safety rule, it is not considered to be an untreated soil amendment because there is just not research available to validate this treatment process against those standards that I showed you a few slides previously. So our recommendation is for growers that are using vermicompost, our current recommendation, it might change once more data becomes available, but it is that growers could follow up with a valid thermophilic treatment, like a windrow compost. Next. Okay, I also briefly wanted to touch on compost tea. And when I say compost tea, this is a tea, a water extract of treated compost. And oftentimes I hear about it being used in a foliar application for its disease suppression benefits. So the key that I want to highlight here is that for the compost tea to be considered treated, it has to be used with a treated soil amendment in microbially safe water. So water with no detectable generic E. coli, and it cannot contain supplemental microbial nutrients like molasses. The other thing is in the FSMA produce safety rule, if it is only applied to plant foliage, it does not meet the definition of a biological soil amendment of animal origin. It would actually be regulated under agricultural water. Next. Okay, so, excuse me. Just to wrap up that entire discussion from the last 30 minutes or so, I just wanted to kind of revisit that if you are using a treatment process that is not validated currently to reduce microbial risks, it must be considered untreated. And we talk a lot about untreated soil amendments in last week's webinar, which I know Libby also linked to in the links. Next. And okay, so the last couple of slides before we move into Q&A, the first thing I wanted to talk a little bit is just, again, a reminder about using treated soil amendments in produce fields. So under the produce safety rule, compost treated with a validated process allows for a 0-day application interval. And I'm mentioning this here because there was, in the survey, it showed that about 28% of growers, organic growers surveyed, were using compost for side dressing. And I just want to say that even though it's treated, does not mean that it's zero risk. And so even though the produce safety rule allows for a 0-day application interval, it's not something that we necessarily recommend because something like side dressing or where that compost might touch the harvestable part of the crop, the actual produce growing, or the flowers, it does run the risk of directly contacting produce. Next. Okay, so in storing and handling soil amendments, we talked about this a little bit last week, and I just wanted to highlight the big picture here is minimizing contamination between untreated and treated soil amendments. Next. And I want to allow for plenty of time for question and answer. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the documentation requirements, and then we're going to hand it back over to the panel. The big thing I want to highlight here for documentation is the documentation requirements under the produce safety rule, and that there is a fact sheet available. Libby just linked to it, and she also included it, I think, in the handouts. But for the produce safety rule, you must keep records of the composting treatment process. So this is going to be time, temperature, turning records, very similar to what NOP requires. And purchase compost must have a certificate of conformance provided by the seller at least annually. And just again, there is a very brief fact sheet with a template certificate of conformance if that's something that you're interested in. Next. Okay, and I just want to very quickly highlight that the National Organic Program does have record keeping requirements that overlap with the produce safety rule, but it also requires records of soil amendment use, such as the one shown here, type and source of application, and things like that. But for all growers, even if you are not required to comply with the produce safety rule or the National Organic Program, record keeping is a great way to show that your composting process is actually working. And that's something, even in my backyard compost, I actually keep a record of the temperature because I have a terrible memory, and it helps me show that my composting process is functioning. Next. Okay, so I briefly wanted to thank our collaborators here. As Amber mentioned earlier, that this was a huge collaborative effort in the research and a lot of the outreach and the needs assessment performed. And next. This slide set is actually part of an outreach objective in the OREI project. So we would highly appreciate your input as we continue to refine the content of the presentation. I have put up a Qualtrics survey. There's a link here and in the chat box. Please do take a couple of minutes. It's very brief. If you have any input on changes or adaptations that we can make to the slide set. And I will mention that one randomly selected survey will win a basket of goodies from the store, from the dairy store.
Donna, this is Betsy.
Yep.
I do want to go back, if we can go back a slide, I do want to encourage people to fill that out because there's been some really interesting comments in the box today. So it's really, really short. I'm going to stress what Donna said. It's a super short survey. You really could win some nice stuff and it really helps. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
Thank you, Betsy. And with that, I'm going to actually turn it back over to Amber.
There I am. Thank you so much for that, Donna. There's like an incredible amount of information in that presentation. We have about 7 minutes or 6 minutes for questions. So we're probably not going to be able to get to everything today, but I will just dive right in and invite both Alda and Betsy to return. Thank you. And let's just start asking some of these questions. I actually have one for Alda from last week's presentation. Maybe just some clarification because you mentioned some factors for food safety risks. And there was a question of which one has the biggest impact on pathogen presence. So some that you mentioned were land use, irrigation water, agronomic factors, environmental factors, the soil or the soil amendment. And is there any one that has a larger impact than another, or are they all the same?
That's a great question. So in our study, we found some fact, it's in agreement with previous studies on conventional fields production. So what is consistent across the studies in our was the presence of pathogens in manure for specifically Listeria. The land use, for example, was that land use for livestock or presence of fecal material in the soil. So that's more on agroecological and management side. Then on water, we observed the surface water as well. So the bottom line, without going so much on detail, was depend on the pathogen, but there are some consistent factors that would contribute to the risk. And there are other ones that was decrease the risk as depending of the year, what time we sample. So it's specific for the pathogen, and I think that's the greatness of this study. We're able to follow 2 different pathogens and observe that is specific risks there increase the risk. And then on climatic or weather is consistent as well with other studies. precipitation. So it comes over and over if there is a raining event that increases the potential risk.
That's great. And then just maybe a follow-up to that, somebody else asked whether or how much manure incorporation into the soil might affect the levels of pathogens.
So we did record how much they were applied, so the pounds per acre and duplication. And in these survey farms, we observed that rototiller or spadding, for those farms, they decrease the risk compared to the farms they use in combination other ways of incorporation of the manure.
Great, thank you. So for Betsy, you mentioned a really interesting survey result that showed that a lot of folks were using or getting their sources of compost from, these local non-commercial sites. And somebody asked how trustworthy biological soil amendments can be that are purchased from companies, commercial companies, rather than what you can get from your own farm or, from your farmer neighbor down the road.
So I'm just going to try and go by not dogging on anyone in particular based on their size, location, or where they're at. So if people are buying compost from other folks, you can always ask what the process is, right? You can ask for the documentation and you can ask them questions. So it could be that there is a neighbor who is doing a very good job of composting. I have been on some smaller farms that do a spectacular job. They're Windrow, they're well managed. And so to me, it comes down to being an informed buyer, if you will. In the same way that buyers ask growers about their practices, growers should feel empowered to ask people that they're buying materials from about their practices, right? And so I really don't want to say that a small compost producer is somewhat more questionable than a large compost producer, if that makes sense. The issue is what are their practices? And as a buyer of that product, you can absolutely ask for those details.
Thanks. And I actually am not sure if I said Betsy or Donna there. Sort of like you guys are two peas in a pod for me, so I might have accidentally interchanged you.
Yeah, you said Betsy, so I answered it, but you might have meant Donna.
Yeah, I meant Donna. But anyways, that's a great answer. Thank you. And we are running pretty short on time, but I'd like to get one more question in if people can hang on, because I think this is a good one. What manure type from which animal is the safest to use when it comes to pathogen presence? Maybe I'll start with with Alda, sorry, and then I'll have Donna add some comments to that. Thank you.
Yep.
I think it depends. So we have to remember that all the livestock and poultry, they are reservoirs for most of the pathogens that concern in human health. And we know there is variations when they can shed more or less, for example, the season for livestock side. And there are other factors that affect the presence of the manure and survival. Although saying that across most of the studies, experimental or on farm, we see that poultry litter, soil amendments with poultry litter, the survival of generic E. coli and other pathogens is longer, extend over time. In our study specifically, we didn't find any difference. Doesn't mean there is, so we can't tell this is the best. It depends on many different risks and conditions. Donna, do you have anything to add to that?
I was just going to add, I'm going to take a different perspective. I know you talked about risk. I was going to say, because we were talking about treatments in this webinar, consider there are different nutrient loads in different types of manure. And so if you are going through a compost treatment process, think about that carbon to nitrogen ratio, balancing it or optimizing it for treatment. So For example, I mentioned poultry litter is going to be very different than like horse bedding. So poultry litter would probably need to be amended to add some carbon into it. So just if you were thinking from the treatment perspective, make sure you look up some composting resources and amend it in a way that optimizes that treatment.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And with that, we're at time. I need to hand it back over to Libby for some last minute housekeeping. Thank you all so much, the panelists and the audience, for your engagement today. We really appreciate it.
Great, thanks so much, Amber. And thanks to all of you that are in attendance today on behalf of the staff and members of the Organic Trade Association. Many thanks to Donna, Alda, and Betsy for your insightful presentations and the discussion today. We really appreciate your time and your commitment to organic. As a reminder, a link to view the recording from today's webinar as well as last week's webinar will be sent out in the next couple of business days. We'll also include slides, handouts, including a couple of new handouts I just uploaded to the platform about 10 minutes ago, and all of the wonderful links that we were provided from the presenters today. A short survey will be appearing on the system right after we wrap up, if you can respond to that, and then also to the survey from our friends at the Produce Safety Alliance and all the researchers. We would greatly appreciate all of that. On behalf of the Organic Trade Association and the Organic Center, we hope you join us for future webinars. And please have a wonderful day. Thanks, everyone.